Presented by ChargebackGurus.com.
Protect yourself from chargebacks with fraud filters. If you've got a fraud problem, you've got a chargeback problem. Chargeback rights were enshrined in the law specifically to combat the problem of credit card fraud, which has only grown more pervasive as e-commerce takes over our shopping habits. True fraud chargebacks are especially problematic because they cannot be fought after the fact, only prevented in advance. One way for merchants to get ahead of fraudsters is by using fraud filters that identify and screen out potentially fraudulent transactions. How well do fraud filters really work, and how they best be used to proactively avoid true fraud chargebacks? Online retail fraud keeps growing more and more prevalent, costing merchants hundreds of millions of dollars every year. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic pushed consumers towards e-commerce shopping in even greater numbers. And all that increased activity, which has caused a commensurate rise in fraud attempts. When a consumer finds out that their card has been stolen and used to make unauthorized purchases, their best recourse is to report the fraud to their bank and receive a chargeback. Chargebacks may be a satisfactory remedy for consumers, but they push the financial liability for fraud onto merchants. To make matters worse, an excessive rate of fraud and chargebacks can get merchants forcibly enrolled in costly mitigation programs, or even cause them to lose their merchant accounts. Because of this, it's essential for every merchant to use the best tools and resources at their disposal to preemptively stop fraud. This is where fraud filters come into play. What are fraud filters? A fraud filter is a program that analyzes transaction data as it is being submitted through your online ordering system. Some fraud filters will be pre-configured to look for certain fraud indicators, and others can be customized by the merchant to scan for different data categories and thresholds. When a fraud filter encounters transaction data that it deems to be potentially fraudulent, it can either reject the order or flag it for the merchant to manually review. Here are some common types of fraud filters. AVS-CVV matching. These filters make sure that the card's billing address and CVV number are correct before processing the transaction. They can also flag orders where the billing address and the shipping address don't match. Velocity checking. Many fraudsters test out stolen payment card credentials by making small transactions just to see if the card still works. Velocity filters look for small, frequent transaction attempts and will flag the associated accounts or IP addresses. Purchase amount thresholds. Some filters can simply flag all orders over a certain amount for manual review. Customer location. Merchants who know that certain IP addresses or geolocations are frequent sources of fraud can set up filters that will automatically block or flag transactions originating from these sources. Risk scoring. The most sophisticated fraud filters analyze multiple data points and assign a score that reflects how likely it is that the transaction is fraudulent. Transactions with a high score can then be filtered out for further review. Many of these filters utilize machine learning and artificial intelligence to improve the accuracy of their scoring algorithms. How effective are fraud filters? Using fraud filters effectively is a constant balancing act. If your filtering rules aren't strict enough, fraudulent orders may pass through, and the point of having fraud filters is defeated. However, if they are too strict, there is a significant risk that you will filter out orders from legitimate, non-fraudulent customers. Being false flagged as a fraudster can be an extremely frustrating experience for a customer. And when you erroneously reject a legitimate order, there's a chance that the customer will leave and never come back. While methods like velocity checking and CVV matching may have low false positive rates, these types of filters tend to work only with unskilled, low-effort fraudsters. Experienced fraudsters will often have a complete set of payment credentials, and will have done their card testing elsewhere before attempting a large purchase. These fraudsters are very good at making themselves look like real customers, and that means that setting up fraud filters that can catch them greatly increases your risk of blocking and alienating your actual customers. What's the best way to use fraud filters? To get the best ROI on a fraud filtering solution, you need to be successful at lowering your fraud rates without rejecting legitimate customers and losing out on sales revenue. The best way to achieve this is to get a clear and accurate picture of how and by whom you are being targeted. By analyzing the data from transactions involved in fraud disputes, you can identify the characteristics of the fraud that is actually affecting you. For example, some merchants may find that the vast majority of their fraud is coming from a few specific countries. If you don't get a lot of legitimate orders from those countries, it may be safe to simply use a highly restrictive geolocation filter. Conversely, merchants who sell digital goods or gifts for third parties may find that using AVS filtering doesn't match many fraudsters at all, and inconveniences a lot of valid customers. By using data analytics to profile your fraudsters, you can configure and train your filters with a high degree of specificity. Also, remember that a flagged transaction doesn't necessarily need to be rejected. You can subject it to manual review or even contact the customer directly to verify whether or not it's legitimate. Conclusion: fraud filters can be a very effective way to draw your attention to potentially fraudulent transactions before you process them, but you have to be careful about relying on them too heavily. Even the most finely tuned fraud filters can generate false positives and false negatives, both of which have adverse consequences for your business. The best way to use fraud filters is to make them part of a comprehensive strategy for preventing fraud and chargebacks that utilizes various methodologies tailored to your specific circumstances. Online fraud comes in many forms, and not every merchant will have the same experience with it. Analyzing your fraud data and choosing the right tools for the job will give you the best outcomes for blocking fraud and the chargebacks that follow it.
To learn more, visit chargebackgurus.com.